y'all that know me know that I'm not one for prepared remarks. I'm usually a little bit more extemporaneous than that. And so William will probably be fairly surprised that I've actually made a few notes. But I wanted to give our speaker the credit that's due today. I've introduced him in prior events and speaking engagements, and really in context of what he does here for the Historical Society. But I have done something to your computer. I think I have. No, it's working. It's just not on the screen. But I just wanted to put everything in context of the growing vita that he has of his academic work and studies. And so I'd like to introduce William E. Hardy today. His educational background, he received his MA from the University of Louisville and studied under Dr. Thomas Mackey, and many of you all might have come to hear him speak when he was here for, I believe, our Lincoln exhibit lectures, and might be familiar with his work. And he is a PhD candidate from the University of Tennessee in the Department of History. His dissertation will be defended in, I believe, probably 2 weeks. 2 weeks, and has the date set. Along with it, will be adding a new wonderful baby girl to his family about the same time. So this is going to be a big April for the Hardys. And his advisor is Dr. Stephen Ash, and many of y'all are familiar with his work as well. Also, while he was at the University of Tennessee, or has been at the University of Tennessee, he's received 2 graduate awards that may have familiar names attached, with a Bruce Wheeler Graduate Award in 2010, and then in the year 2007-2008 school year, a name that I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with, Dr. Paul H. Bergeron Award, which recognized an outstanding student in American 19th century history. Publications, he is going to be the editor of the forthcoming After the War Reconstruction volume from the Tennessee Historical Society's series of Civil War volumes that they are producing for the sesquicentennial. That is forthcoming in 2015, and that will correspond with the sesquicentennial events. The signature events will be in Knoxville during that year, and you will be hearing more about that. Historic photos of Knoxville and the paperback version, Remembering Knoxville, are 2 of our best sellers in our museum store, and he is the author of those 2 titles. And many articles related to the Civil War, 19th century, and other areas of interest that he has for the Journal of East Tennessee History and the Tennessee Historical Quarterly, as well as Civil War History Journal and others. Teaching, he is adjunct lecturer with Lincoln Memorial University and teaches a course on Lincoln's life and legacy that tends to be one of their most popular courses. And since 2006, William has served with me as manager on our Teaching American History grants. And I think we make a decent team, but he's the person, I might have, come up with all these ideas and plans, but the person that really makes it work and works one-on-one with the teachers, and it really impacted, I know, students across the counties that we've worked with, the school districts that we've worked with. William has made all that happen. And he's also served in the curatorial aspect here at the Historical Society on the Lincoln exhibit, as well as our forthcoming Civil War exhibit. He will be helping in his scholarship and his academic advice. But his love, and I think his true legacy, will be National History Day. Many of y'all have heard about our being the sponsors and co-coordinators of the National History Day program on a district level for East Tennessee. And I am one of the co-coordinators along with William, but it is thanks to his hard work, his love, his passion for history and for working with these students that East Tennessee students have been as successful as they have over the past years. And in fact, I guess the past 5 years, we have had national winners. And each one of those students has brought their projects more than once to William to get his advice and his insight. And I think it's thanks to him that we have seen the success and that we have so many future historians coming along. I know I've spent way too much time in this introduction, but I just want to, again, give him the credit and just say how much we appreciate him and how much we're looking forward to his comments today. William Hardy.
Lisa's too kind. I told her to embellish makeup, and that's what she did. It sounds like I wear a lot of hats. I do. And so today, what I'll have is a little different than what I usually do when I teach. I don't really like to use notes when I teach. I like to walk all over the room and get involved, get the students involved. But today it is a busy April. It's a very busy April. So I'll probably be doing a little bit more formal than I would like in a talk, more or less reading a little bit. But there's a lot of good stuff to read here today, especially probably the primary subject of today's talk, William G. Brownlow, who has some interesting language that he used throughout his career. Let me first say that thank you to Lisa and Cheryl and my time here at the East Tennessee Historical Society. I've been here quite a while. So Dr. Ash and my committee members are happy that I am now, the end is in sight. The defense is 2 weeks, on the 26th actually. So I'm looking forward to that date and for them to haze me and harass me for what they tell me is like going to be 6 hours or something. So looking forward to that. When I came to East Tennessee in the fall of 2004, or actually I visited here in April 2004, this week, 9 years ago. Me and my wife came down, and I had several colleges to choose from for my PhD program, but my heart was set on Tennessee. Even though I went against the wishes of my advisor at the University of Louisville in choosing UT, I wanted to come here because of the complex story. And the subject I had mostly studied as a undergraduate and graduate at U of L was Reconstruction, which is often seen as this after the Civil War, another phase. The Civil War ends and Reconstruction begins. It's seen as a separate subject, but in fact, Reconstruction and the Civil War are one and the same. Civil War is on the battlefield, Reconstruction's in the political arena. They should be seen as one and the same. The Civil War era stretches throughout from 1860s, and actually a little bit before, and into the 1870s, and historians are now pushing Reconstruction, the Civil War era, into the 20th century. But in Tennessee, it's often seen as, like in a lot of other areas, divided. In 1865, the Civil War ends and Reconstruction begins. The radical regime of William Brownlow and the radical Republicans come into power. But no, it's one and the same, and I found in this topic that I chose, which was the period after Brownlow left Tennessee, from February 1869 to November 1870. That was my period of examination on my dissertation. This was a period that, frankly, no one had ever done, no one had ever touched. It had merely been the conclusion on studies on Brownlow and the preface on studies on Tennessee and the New South. Merely a chapter at most in these studies, but no one had done a full-length study. And I wondered, is the historiography, the history of the Civil War and Tennessee's Reconstruction, tells a story that when Brownlow left, Reconstruction collapsed. As if immediately, as if his successor, who is not known, DeWitt Clinton, he was Brownlow's successor. He was the Speaker of the Senate. So he succeeded the governor when the governor resigned his office, and Brownlow was going to the U.S. Senate. Who was this guy? You look in some books, not just the internet, Wikipedia, that all-knowing source, but you look in textbooks, they can't even, there's not even there's on Center's birth, there's differences, 1830, 1826, 1832. I had to go to his grave site, Jarnigan Cemetery in, that's Jefferson or Granger? Granger, thank you. Had to go to his cemetery to actually see when he was born and when he died, to be sure on that. So there wasn't much known. And what was known was outdated. Quite frankly, we're talking Gone with the Wind era historiography. History that was written long before the 1940s. And it painted, quite frankly, Brownlow in a negative light. And my advisor, when he does talks on Brownlow, he begins by polling the crowd, usually asking for the crowd to participate with a hurrah for Brownlow if they support him, they think he's the saint, and then a down with Brownlow if they think the opposite, that he was a sinner. Well, I'm not going to go there because I can probably know what the audience is generally going to say. But Brownlow in himself was deeply in need of context, revision, what historians do. And that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk about first Brownlow and his personal characteristics, which are very important in understanding Tennessee's Civil War era. I'll talk about his administration. And then after that, we'll move into the period after Brownlow left Tennessee. Sort of a 3-act drama here, a performance. I hope my clicker here is going to work. My computer's flashing at me some weird colors, so hopefully it works. All right. Now let's begin with Brownlow and his personal qualities that play such a pivotal role in understanding Reconstruction in Tennessee. He was born into poverty in rural southwestern Virginia, essentially in a frontier-like setting. And I use this image because the Metro Pulse a couple years ago ran this most hated in Knoxville. I mean, he's, quite frankly, when the polls are done, he's the most hated in Tennessee, hands down. Historians did a poll in, I think, 1981 with the Tennessee Historical Society, and Brownlow came in, they rated 1 to 10. He came in, I think it was a 1 or even a 0.0. And the next one up was like a 3 or something. And I believe it was Governor, was it Blanton? I'm going to have to ask for help here. The one who ended up going to prison, right? So you can see how far center's behind Brownlow's behind the Governor Blanton. Brownlow was born in this frontier, southwestern Virginia area. He was orphaned at the age of 11, apprenticed out as a carpenter, and he eventually became a circuit-riding Methodist minister who traveled all over southern Appalachia in a crusade to save souls and from the devil and other denominations. And for the rest of his life, he would be better known as Parson Brownlow, even long after he gave up his ministry. After settling in East Tennessee in the 1830s, Brownlow established a newspaper, and he believed that he had found his calling as a newspaper editor. He used the newspaper to promote all of his pet causes, especially the Whig Party, which he was a member of. He maintained throughout his life the rustic demeanor of a frontier Virginian, unpolished in his dress, unpolished in his speech, and unpolished in his manners. He was much like Lincoln in a sense that he was self-taught, climbed the ladder of success. Some say he looks like Lincoln, two unattractive men that they are. But he never made an attempt to refine himself, to hide these rustic frontier origins, so one would think he was a man of some standing. He was plain-spoken, but whether he was in the pulpit or on the stump, he captivated his audiences, not by eloquent phrasing and intricate arguments that great statesmen and theologians of the age did, but rather he captivated his audiences with rhetorical wrath, his vindictive, vitriolic, humiliating insults. His attitude, why debate the issues when you can simply humiliate your opponent? A sampling of Brownlow's published insults, often mean, cruel, outrageously false, but could also be wickedly funny. Brownlow on Harriet Beecher Stowe. I'm going to look around just to make sure I'm on the right slide because I can't see. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was here recently. She is ugly as original sin and abomination in the eyes of civilized people. A tall, coarse, vulgar-looking woman, stoop-shouldered, with a long yellow neck and a long picket nose through which she speaks. Harriet Beecher Stowe. Brownlow was no abolitionist. Now he's noted as governor of enfranchising the blacks, but his racial attitudes, not so much. In the 1850s, when the federal government under Democratic President James Buchanan clashed with the Mormons, Brownlow said in an editorial, "If Brownlow will send an army to Utah and exterminate the entire Mormon race, I will declare in favor of his administration." And this is a Democrat from a fervent partisan Whig. In his lifelong battle against the Presbyterians, he was delighted to learn the Presbyterian Church had formed a national organization called the American Sunday School Union, which he made a point, always in speech and print, to abbreviate as the ASS Union. In his classic reply to serving as a chaplain in the Confederate Army in 1861, many people know this one, he said, "When I have made up my mind to go to hell, I will cut my throat and go direct, and not travel there by the way of the Southern Confederacy." Needless to say, he made a lot of enemies. Who was on the receiving end of his rhetorical wrath? Baptists, Presbyterians, Catholics, Mormons, Democrats, Republicans, blacks, Irish immigrants, drinkers, Sabbath breakers, bad poets, philandering husbands, rival newspaper editors, abolitionists, and above all, secessionists. Now, Brownlow's enemies responded in kind with insults themselves. One such enemy publicly announced that he had named his dog after Brownlow. Another enemy, he lies with his pen, he lies with his tongue, he lies with his gestures, he lies through every pore of his shriveled hide. He is a monstrosity. His blood is hell broth, which Satan will one day sip with a long spoon. From his youth up till now, he has had no personal controversy without attacking the wives, fathers, mothers, grandfathers, grandmothers, brothers, sisters, children, uncles, aunts, and nephews of his opponents. He has never had an hour's happiness except in the unhappiness of others. Now, some of his enemies decided verbal dueling was not enough, was not sufficient enough to redeem their personal honor. Brownlow was many times threatened, several times sued, several times beaten up, on at least 2 occasions shot at, once struck, hanged in effigy, indicted, imprisoned, and exiled by his opponents. But these reprisals did not silence him. They merely gave him more ammunition. Compromise, moderation, and fence mending were simply not part of Brownlow's public character, his public vocabulary. His response to opposition, instead of reaching out to his opponents, was invariably to renew his attacks with more fury, more vituperation. So, quick understanding of Brownlow is moderation, compromise is not in this guy's vocabulary. So setting up a guy who is essentially a major figure in Tennessee Civil War era, and then as governor in the post-Civil War, this is not a man who's going to reach out to his opponents, especially defeated rebels, defeated former Confederates. This is not an ideal situation for compromise. And that's something I was interested in, is trying to explain why Tennessee switched so abruptly. When Brownlow resigned to go to Washington, and he had his hand-picked successor, DeWitt Center. How come Center, how did things go so wrong, in Brownlow's opinion? How did it go so wrong? How did the state switch so abruptly? And how could Brownlow allow such a thing to happen? That was something I wanted to explore. Now, of Brownlow's prejudices, some are very distasteful for us today. He was thoroughly racist and portrayed blacks in the usual stereotypical manner of the time as mentally and morally inferior to whites. Now, Brownlow's racial attitudes placed him in the majority of the time, a majority of white Americans in the 19th century. He and 99% of Americans simply did not believe in racial equality. Brownlow was deeply committed to the institution of slavery, and prior to the war, an outspoken defender of the institution. He portrayed slavery as a benevolent institution. It was good for black people. Why? He said it took these heathen, savage Africans out of the jungles of Africa, brought them to this country and introduced them to Christianity and civilization. And furthermore, slavery was sanctioned by the Bible. On the eve of the Civil War, and even after the firing on Fort Sumter, Brownlow continued to argue that slavery was best preserved within the Union. He warned that secession is the shortcut to abolition, that the war could end with the complete destruction of slavery, and for once, when he spoke, it was accurate, he was true. That's exactly what happened. When the Civil War came, it did bring the destruction of slavery. Now, I have some bad echoes going, I can tell now. Is that good for you? Brownlow is primarily responsible for two rows: his stand in favor of the Union during the Civil War, and his 4-year tenure as Tennessee's Reconstruction governor. We'll talk about labels in a minute. In both rows, he brought into play all these characteristics that marked his pre-war career. From 1861 to 1869, you see Brownlow's defiant, uncompromising attitude, the vitriolic, rhetorical thrashing of his opponents, the bold and what some may say rash disregard for the personal consequences of his words and actions. Now, political labels can be very confusing, especially in the Civil War and Reconstruction. And in Tennessee, they can be very confusing. So I'm going to switch gears here for a second, just do a little bit about the political labels of this period. Going into the Civil War and antebellum period, Tennessee had been it was a two-party system, Whigs and Democrats. The Whig Party, Brownlow's party, collapsed nationally in the early 1800s after the Compromise of 1850. But in Tennessee, the system continued. The parties were, for the most part, evenly matched. And if you look at the statistics, and Dr. Paul Bergeron's in the room, his dissertation turned into a book, Antebellum Politics in Tennessee, analyzed the statistics. And it shows the 1840s was the period of Whig control. They won for the most part, defeated the Democrats, but always by razor-thin margins. In the 1850s, it flip-flopped to the Democrats. But again, even though the Democrats were now in control, they always won by razor-thin margins. So constantly, we've got two parties winning by maybe 1% to 2%, sometimes under 1%. And so the parties hardened in their opinions. It just presented a bunch of politicians that were just not skilled in the art of political compromise. And because of Tennessee's situation, when there's this lack of political compromise, this causes all the problems in Tennessee, the Civil War, but especially during Reconstruction. It brought to the forefront additional men like Brownlow, perhaps. Their language was not as eloquent as Brownlow, but we got men like the Democratic Governor Isham Harris at the eve of the Civil War. Another gentleman not skilled in the arts of political compromise. East Tennessee's Andrew Johnson, certainly not skilled in the arts of political compromise. These men ruled with iron fist. Harris, early in the Civil War, driving the state literally to secession when the voters didn't necessarily want secession in February of 1861. But then when subsequent actions occurred, the state moved towards secession. Harris was already prepared, already had an army raised, already had the legislature drafting up the language for the voters. Andrew Johnson ruled with an iron fist during the Civil War as military governor, that Lincoln put him in charge of restoring civil government in Tennessee. Andrew Johnson was very hard on the rebels, punished them. It just sets up a situation. There's just no compromise. It's in Tennessee. Now, first attempt at secession I spoke about from February to June 1861. I'm going to show kind of the sides here real briefly. We've got the rebels. I'm just going to call them the rebels. Part of this rebel democracy, these fire eaters, Isham Harris, the politicians who were wrapping up, getting the rhetoric out of secession, the black abolitionists, black Republicans, Abraham Lincoln. What their real motives were, what they weren't telling us, was that yes, once they got into power, they were going to destroy the institution of slavery. So they're firing up the base, attacking the Republicans, and so they're the first adopters of secession during this period. And then we have the Unionists, the state 70%. To stay in the Union in the February 8th, 1861 referendum, were 30% to secede. East Tennessee and West Tennessee were in the forefront of unionism at this point. Middle Tennessee in the latter category, voting for secession. Then we go into the second attempt at secession, the June 8th, 1861 referendum. And at this point, we're post the firing on Fort Sumter, and the one action that drove Tennessee to secession. It's easy to say, yes, slavery is ultimately the cause of the Civil War. But in the case of Tennessee and Arkansas, North Carolina, and Virginia, if I've got my 4 states correctly here, after the firing on Fort Sumter, there are other reasons, and primarily for Tennesseans, it was Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops. The moment Lincoln said that the states must meet their quota to raise troops to put down the rebellion in South Carolina, Tennesseans switched course overwhelmingly. They were not going to fire on Southerners because we were already a north-south country. People saw themselves that way. And so now the state switches. 70% vote for secession, 30% for Union. East Tennessee, largely Union, except for what some studies have shown that along the rail line and in the cities of East Tennessee, it's really split. Knoxville's it's literally split down the middle between unionism, secession. But once you get out in the rural areas, that's where the unionism of East Tennessee and now Middle and West Tennessee link up and vote for secession, and that switches those votes. So now we have what I call the rebel democracy and secessionist. And these are Whigs and Democrats. It's not as simple as saying all Democrats seceded, Whigs were the Unionists. Well, a lot of Whigs, when the party split in the 1850s, the Whigs gravitated towards the Democratic position, pro-slavery. So a lot of Whigs go, but a lot of Whigs obviously constitute who are the Unionists of Tennessee. And then we've got those who are continuously remaining in the Union. Next critical juncture, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Issued in January 1st, 1863, and I'm kind of drawing this to the end of the war here, and this action alone provokes many Unionists to switch sides here, to switch their loyalties and support the Confederacy. Or some, they're conditional Unionists. They don't approve of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, but they still support the Union. There's some gravitation, and they're going to, when Brownlow comes into power, these are the conditional Unionists are going to join anti-Brownlow. It was the Emancipation Proclamation that broke the allegiance for most of these. Rhoda Campbell Williams of Knoxville wrote to her son, who was away in college, I think it was Princeton, and she wrote to him, and these are these conditional Unionists. They maintain their loyalty, their fidelity to the Union, but they don't like Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And she's writing her son, warning him basically to stay quiet. You're up there in the North, don't start talking about you don't approve of the Emancipation Proclamation. Rhoda says to him, Lincoln's policy has been such as to drive hundreds of men in the South into the rebel army who would today be for the Union, if they had not been convinced that his purpose is to crush the South and make us all slaves. I am as firm in my Union principles as ever, but never will I sanction the abolition policy of Abraham Lincoln. Now, conservative Unionists like the Williams of Knoxville would be severely tested during Brownlow's tenure as governor, as he and his radical legislature enacted numerous prescriptive measures that were deemed ultra-radical. Now, first I just want to say one thing about these gentlemen on the screen and about radical Republicans. This is a label that's been used, Brownlow, radical republicanism. First thing that needs to be cleared up is radical republicanism in Tennessee doesn't necessarily equal radical republicanism in the North, the congressional radical Republicans. That's an outdated view. For example, Brownlow is not a progressive when it comes to racial attitudes. Okay? He'll get there, but not out of idealistic motives. Political necessity will drive him there. The radical Republicans in the North, pictured by Thaddeus Stevens on the left over here and Charles Sumner on the right, these are guys who believe in racial equality, who believe whites and blacks are equal in every way. They could intermarry. Well, that's something that Tennesseans and Brownlow is not going to subscribe to. This is an outdated view. Okay? Birth of a Nation, this late 19th century, early 20th century view. Steven Spielberg, to his credit, in his movie Lincoln, Tommy Lee Jones plays a fantastic role as Thaddeus Stevens. I think outshines Daniel Day-Lewis. It's a great portrayal. And you start to see what the radical Republicans, what were their motives? Today, those are noble motives. But they were pushing so hard at this time because they wanted to get these measures passed. They knew that this was the time. The Civil War was a constitutional crisis. And they knew that they could enact these measures if they drove and pushed hard. And they were pushing Lincoln like crazy, and Spielberg captures that. I have many problems with the Spielberg movie. That's a lecture for another day. But Spielberg, it's a great movie, and he does a great job in depicting the radical Republicans. So again, they're not one and the same. So I like to say maybe radical Unionist, perhaps, rather than radical Republicans, for Brownlow, but for my dissertation purposes and everything else, since the labels have stuck, I use radical Republicans. Now, as the war ended in January 1865, before the war ends, Tennessee starts taking its steps towards restoring civil government. And this is Andrew Johnson's his finest moment as military governor. He achieved his mission, and that was to restore civil government. Of course, he left Tennessee in still a mess. Because this is a state where political compromise does not work. And in doing so, the electorate was very limited to loyal Unionists and people who support Brownlow. And they looked to Brownlow as the leading figure and elected him as governor of Tennessee. So now we have, as during this period of Reconstruction in Tennessee, we have what I call the ex-rebels. Now the war is over. We still have a rebel democracy, the fire eaters, and those who supported secession. An important category in the middle now, the conservatives. And these are the people who play the prominent role in the period under my study, under my dissertation, that period when Brownlow leaves. These conservatives are those who left after the Emancipation Proclamation, these conditional Unionists, and who will gravitate to the conservative wing, the conservative party, during Brownlow's tenure as governor because of his prescriptive measures. And then we have the Republicans, I'll say Republicans there, the radicals and moderates. Okay? Governor Brownlow. From the outset of Reconstruction, Brownlow had two primary goals as governor, both of which went hand in hand. First, he wanted to keep the former Confederates from regaining political power. While East Tennessee constituted the bulk of the state's Unionists, Middle and West Tennessee, a much larger majority than East Tennessee, constituted a sea of gray, as most of these Tennesseans have supported the Confederacy. Now, had these Middle and West Tennessee Confederates gained political power, they would have dominated the state, in effect, reversing the battlefield outcome of the Civil War, and that was not acceptable to Brownlow. Not acceptable to Brownlow and these Unionists who argued we had suffered, been persecuted by these rebels. Second, Brownlow was determined to establish thorough radical control of the state. Initially in 1865, the only way for Brownlow to accomplish these two objectives was to disfranchise the ex-rebels. They could not be allowed to vote, he argued. To that end, a radical elected legislature, which remained thoroughly loyal for most of Brownlow's tenure, enacted a sweeping franchise law that barred an estimated 80,000 former Confederate soldiers. And former Confederates, not just soldiers, but supporters of the Confederacy. There was simply no other viable option available at that point to the radicals in Brownlow, who numbered only 40,000 potential voters. But Brownlow went further, publicly championing the politics of retaliation in a series of editorials and speeches marked by the vitriolic prose and scathing wit that had become his trademark. He essentially argued that the rebels put us through hell, and now it's payback time. He encouraged radical Unionists to seek retribution through courts of law, social ostracism, and even physical violence. Brownlow essentially transformed vengeance into a state religion and exemplified the bitterness of those Unionists who had been persecuted during the war. In the summer of 1865, when a group of former Confederates in East Tennessee pleaded for Brownlow to protect them from the reprisals of revenge-seeking Unionists, Brownlow responded by insisting that, quote, every field of carnage, every rebel prison, every Union man's grave unite with a violated law and demand the penalty, and if the courts do not administer it, an outraged people will. The rebels, Brownlow argued, had, quote, forfeited all right of protection in life, and therefore he proclaimed that, quote, I am not among those who would restrain their vengeance against their oppressors. Another radical succinctly put the matter, the only right the rebels have is to be hung. Now, ensuring that these former rebels were kept politically powerless and subjugated was not enough for Brownlow. Among the Unionists were a sizable number of conservative Unionists. During the war, these conservatives, again, had opposed Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and advocated a lenient Reconstruction policy toward the Confederates. After the war, these conservative Unionists were ready to forgive the defeated rebels, enfranchise them, and welcome them back as fellow U.S. citizens. To Brownlow, as you can imagine, these conservatives were no better than the rebels, just as dangerous as the rebels. Although he had no legal means to deprive these conservatives' enemies of the vote, he managed to effectively disfranchise nearly 30,000 conservative voters with the aid of a compliant legislature that granted him the power to manipulate voter registrations and the ballot box. But even then, he still worried about the security of his homegrown radical Republican Party. He was so concerned as to his administration's ability to stay in power and to keep the rebels subjugated and powerless. So in February 1867, he took his most controversial step. For political rather than idealistic motives, he pushed black enfranchisement through the General Assembly. Tennessee became the first southern state to enfranchise blacks. Mind you, that's before a lot of northern states enfranchised blacks. And these are northern states who are pushing, eventually would push, a month later, congressional military reconstruction on the South, remanding them to military rule and enfranchising blacks. It was an action that predated, even the congressional rules. Now, as you can imagine, a cry went up throughout this state at this ultra-radical step. In a letter to his father, Samuel Fane, a conservative secessionist from Rogersville in Hawkins County, confided that, I had a vote, and I tell you it was hard for me to vote side by side with a Negro. Brownlow responded to this uproar among conservatives and the ex-rebels, quote, a loyal Negro is worth far more than a disloyal white man. Again, his motives in enfranchising blacks were not Idealistic, hardly idealistic. He advocated black suffrage simply for political motives to keep his party in power. If he thought he could have won without black votes, he would not have done so. But with the enfranchisement of blacks, the disfranchisement of rebels, and partial disfranchisement of conservative Unionists, Brownlow easily won election as governor in 1867, and the radicals maintained their power. Now, from this point in which Tennessee became, at least in theory, a biracial democracy, the former Confederates increasingly responded to their powerlessness with organized violence, especially the terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan. These mass marauders donned numerous disguises to hide their identities as they unleashed their fury against blacks active in politics and any whites who were supportive of them. They launched campaigns that spread a wave of terror throughout Middle and West Tennessee. On occasion, they would operate in East Tennessee, but mostly in Middle and West Tennessee. In response to the Ku Klux Klan, and to further enforce the decrees of his administration, Brownlow adopted a paramilitary strategy. In 1867, Brownlow urged the legislature to create a state guard, his own radical Republican army, to be placed at his command. The radical militia not only battled the Klan, but on occasion intimidated peaceful opponents of his regime, those conservatives. But the state guard by no means won a complete victory over the Klan. The Klan simply adopted new tactics. When the state guard came out, the Klan went into hiding, and they simply waited. And they waited. Now, the election of 1867, when the State Guard was initiated, it did work for the radicals. As the Klan went underground and the State Guard remained in the field, blacks felt secure enough to vote, and the radicals won. But the moment the election was over and the legislature saw this costly expense, no army to fight, they disbanded the State Guard. And when the State Guard was disbanded, the Klan came out from their hiding places and once again launched a campaign of terror throughout Middle and West Tennessee. Now, in response to Klan terrorism, Brownlow called the legislature into special session in 1868, and he sought more stringent prescriptive legislation, notably an anti-Klan act to prosecute Klansmen and a militia enforcement law to raise yet another state militia with more power placed in Brownlow's hands. Now, despite the necessity for such legislation, this special session of radical legislature exposed a serious breach within the Brownlows party. His house was truly divided. First of all, represented by William Stokes here, he was congressman of Tennessee. Stokes was upset like many radicals because Brownlow wouldn't relinquish power, and he sort of had his own chosen favorites who he would not ask to step aside. And so William Stokes and a group of radicals within the party were upset that they weren't being allowed to run for office. And Stokes in particular, in 1867, launched a bid to run for governor. Well, he thought Brownlow wouldn't run. Brownlow was sick. Brownlow was always sick. He just wouldn't die. And when Brownlow decided he would run for re-election, he mustered enough power to rehabilitate, to regain his health. Stokes had to give way. So Stokes went out on the campaign trail, did his duty to the party, and campaigned for Brownlow. And when it was over, Brownlow's governor, Stokes thought his reward was the U.S. Senate. And back in those days, the legislature decided the Senate. And so he figured that Brownlow would direct the legislature to vote Stokes into the Senate. But Brownlow decided he wanted to be the U.S. Senator. And Brownlow put his name in the hat to run for the Senate, and Stokes had to what? Step aside. No, he didn't. This time he stood firm and combated Brownlow. Of course, Brownlow will win, but Stokes is angry, and a group of radicals are upset. And so now Brownlow has a faction within his party at odds with him. Well, there's another faction as well, the moderates, led by DeWitt Center, who was the Speaker of the Senate. And these moderates were a sense, sort of like the conservatives. They wanted a lenient Reconstruction. They thought it was time to enfranchise the rebels. They'd suffer enough. We just needed to disfranchise them for the brief tenure and regain political power. Now it was our time to reconstitute this party. Center wanted to reach out to the conservatives to bring them back into the party. Wanted to reconstitute the Republican Party to hopefully enlist respectable white Southerners. Wanted to kind of form a party of the center. But what Center is doing here is he's trying to inject some political compromise into Tennessee, but it just doesn't work. Center tried, but again, compromise is impossible in Tennessee. So we got these moderate Republicans, and they're a minority. Something else going on at this time. President Grant is elected, and he is, during this period of 1869, getting ready to take over for Andrew Johnson, who is out of the White House. And President Grant was seen as the central figure who would reunite this country. And Grant had a simple election campaign slogan: "Let us have peace." Now, what do these four simple words mean? Well, Grant's campaign slogan expressed the desire of many Americans, North and South, in the late 1860s after the war. It promised an end to a long, bitter conflict. It suggested that violence would not be tolerated. With peace came the offer of reconciliation and enfranchisement to white Southerners willing to acknowledge defeat and work toward reunion. Finally, Grant's maxim held out the promise of prosperity sustained by a system of free labor which put an emphasis on education and enterprise. According to Republican ideology, equality of rights and opportunities for all men to bargain freely for labor and services fostered liberty and prosperity. Now, DeWitt Center touted free labor not only as a safeguard of American Republican government, but also as a means for white and black Southerners to achieve prosperity, thus ushering in a new South. Now, Center and many other like-minded moderate Southern Republicans sought to reconstitute this Republican Party, recruiting respectable white Southerners, shifting away from the sectional questions and issues and black class legislation toward pressing issues of economic development. And that black class legislation that was seen as Brownlow and the Radicals, were passing legislation only for blacks, not for the general welfare of the people. And that was an idea at that time, was laws should be passed to help the general welfare, not for specific people or specific classes. Blacks. What about blacks? The freed people of Tennessee. They were also critical of Brownlow and his administration. Now, they were happy when they got the right to vote in February 1867. And this is the high tide of radical republicanism in Tennessee. And they thought with the vote would come the office. But that did not come, the right to hold elective office. The Tennessee radical Republicans, that's something that just wasn't possible. Brownlow wasn't in for that. Giving blacks the right to hold elective office. Also, the 14th Amendment, the civil rights, blacks were barred from jury service, testifying in courts. There was some there was some segregation of public accommodations. Blacks thought things would get better. They really did. They looked at Brownlow. But the Republicans were not welcoming them in. And so they grew upset and gathered together and formed these colored conventions that they held throughout. But again, they're powerless, able neither to leave the Republican Party nor control it. Tennessee's freed people became, in effect, second-class partners in the Republican Party. Now, in 1869, when Brownlow goes off to the Senate and turns over control of power to DeWitt Clinton Center, the Ku Klux Klan have a field day throughout Middle and West Tennessee. They launch yet another campaign of terror, and Brownlow and Center comes in and he's trying for moderation. He's got The state guard out there that Brownlow has, Brownlow got a second state guard. The legislature granted him that, and extra powers. And Center wants to show moderation, wants to show that I'm willing to work with the conservatives. So he modifies Brownlow's law, his powers, modifies the legislature's militia law, the state guard, quickly begins to disband them, all in an effort to show moderation. Well, William Stokes and the Stokes radicals, I call them, rise up to take over Brownlow's position as the ultra-radicals, the hardline radicals in the party. And Center and the moderates take a more moderate approach, obviously. This is a period when the Republicans are divided between each other, and the conservatives are waiting for an opportunity, and they begin to play off these two parties and offer that they're willing to support either Stokes or Center if you'll gradually enfranchise us. And there begins to be a battle. Who will do it first? Will Center or will Stokes do it? Stokes and the ultra-radicals harden. They get more radicalized, even more than Brownlow did during his administration. And Center will moderate and will suddenly turn to extend the olive branch to the conservatives, and using Brownlow's radical election machinery, which had commissioners of registration in each county who oversaw the issuing of voter certificates to people. So they, under Brownlow's tenure, basically disfranchised those they didn't want to vote. They made sure that only loyal radical voters were going to get the right to vote. Center takes out Brownlow's commissioners and puts in his own men. And he puts in conservatives because he wants to win their support, win their vote. And the conservatives, now that they have the power of the Commissioner of Registration, begin to gradually enfranchise conservatives, not rebels yet, not former Confederates. And the conservatives now, their electorate increases. And slowly, the process of the Republican Party is dividing further. And the Supreme Court gets involved. And interestingly enough, the Supreme Court, Brownlow's court, is a lame duck court at this time, the Tennessee Supreme Court. Laws had been changed, some moderation in the legislature to allow the election of justices to the court. Under Brownlow's rule, his regime, he appointed his own men to the court to ensure loyal people. Now these are loyal people to him. However, what's happened is now there's going to be an election, and the ultra-radicals, the Stokes, want to put their own men on the bench. And these lame duck justices, knowing they're going to lose, gradually shift toward this moderation, this position of extending the franchise. Let us have peace. That's the tagline you see in the newspapers of this time. Let us have peace. Now that Grant is in the White House, it's time to let go. And the justices have an important case before them. It has to do with extending certificates to voters. And they say that the governor cannot disfranchise, cannot manipulate the voter ballot, which was what Brownlow was doing. So a court of Brownlow's own choosing, who have now been deposed by these ultra-radicals of Stokes. And again, Stokes is all fueled by Brownlow himself. You can see Brownlow's characteristics, his policies, his lack of moderation is the undoing of his own regime. He essentially destroys his own regime. And when the Supreme Court rules in favor of conservative voters, suddenly the conservative voters are there. The commissioners, Center's commissioners, start extending the vote to former Confederates. And the radicals cry out, you can't do that. They're disfranchised. The court, still the lame duck court, before they're out, before these new radical elected Stokes men get on the bench, they rule that if anyone has a voter certificate, it's a legal right to vote. And suddenly the former Confederates start rushing to these conservatives who don't want to have any part of Brownlow. And furthermore, they don't want to have anything to do with Center. They're playing him because Center is still attached to the Republicans. He still supported Brownlow's most unredeemable act, black enfranchisement. That's not cool. And so, essentially, now the conservatives are working hand in hand with the Confederates. It's a long drawn out. It makes for a nice sleep aid. This is the dissertation. It's hard to do. I thought the only thing I could do today is sort of set up this uncompromising policy of Tennessee politicians and Brownlow. And essentially, Brownlow is the undoing of his own regime. I've gone over a little bit. I'd like to think that wonderful thing may have taken a few minutes, but no. I loved every minute of it, Lisa. I'm going to stop there. I'll be happy to take any questions, but thank you for coming out.